Aloha and welcome to Ehana Ka Ko. We're here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute. One of the sad facts of living in modern Hawaii today is the rise of homelessness, and indeed a housing crisis that affects the middle class to a terrible extent. We also have an exodus from the islands of many people who'd rather live here, but leave the islands in order to afford the cost of living. Today, I'm with an expert who has written a report published by the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii that takes a look at land use policies here in the state and their impact, indeed disparate impact, upon minorities and others who are affected deeply by the housing crisis. The good news is that we can put our finger on one of the causes of the housing crisis. My guest today is Randal O Toole. He is known well and far and wide for his work on the Hawaii rail situation, as well as other transportation issues. He's an expert on autonomous cars, just a fascinating individual. Amongst his credentials is the fact that he is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. However, today he's not here representing any other organization. He's here in his capacity, at least Skyping here in his capacity as a Grassroot Institute scholar, to talk with us about some of the research that he's published recently. Let's welcome to our program Randal O Toole. Randal, aloha and welcome.
Aloha, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for wearing that lovely aloha shirt. It's a beautiful reminder that even up in Oregon you can have the aloha spirit.
Well, it's a classic rain spooner, and I live in a part of Oregon where you can wear these shirts quite a bit of the year.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm joined today by Joe Kent, our Vice President for Research and Development at the Grassroot Institute. Joe, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me too.
Well, I think, Joe, one of the reasons that you're here today is because you're absolutely fascinated with the work of Randal O Toole, and I want to thank you for reaching out and working with him on this recent project.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really inspired by the paper that Randal helped us with, and it's on our website at www.grassrootinstitute.org if you'd like to read it.
That's right. In fact, what's the title of that recent research study?
The title of the paper is Using Disparate Impact to Restore Housing Affordability and Property Rights. So that's a mouthful.
Yes, it is.
But really, we're talking about how to solve Hawaii's affordable housing crisis.
That's right. Yeah, and what it's pointing out is that our land use policies actually affect those who are the poor, or as well those who are racial minorities in a way that is much more powerful than other people. Randal, tell us a little bit about your interest in the Hawaii housing market. What observations have you made?
Well, I've been looking at housing all over the country, and where you don't have states or urban areas strongly regulating land, housing is very affordable. The fastest growing cities in the country are able to gain more than 100,000 people a year without having any impact on their housing prices.
Well, that's a very powerful thesis, your observation that places that are looser or less demanding in terms of land use regulation actually solve the housing problem much better. But give us some of your observations of Hawaii. What have you seen here in our housing situation?
Well, Hawaii has the least affordable housing in the country. A standard measure of affordability is the median home price divided by median family income. And for Hawaii as a whole, the median home prices are almost 7 times median family incomes. And in parts of Hawaii, they're more than 7 times median family incomes. By comparison, the national average is about 2.7 times, and there are lots and lots of places where they're only about home prices are only about twice family incomes. And, Hawaii's housing prices have been like this because of Hawaii's land use law that was passed in 1961.
Well, that's a very, very powerful statement, that it happens to be the laws themselves that are responsible for our housing crisis. What about other causes that people frequently refer to, such as the fact that we are so distant from the sources of supply? We're out in the middle of the Pacific, and so shipping is an integral part of building homes here in Hawaii, or the cost of labor, or the fact that we can't compete, whether it's in agriculture or construction, with low-cost labor elsewhere. Aren't these factors?
Those things are going to have a small effect on prices, but labor is mainly expensive because housing is expensive. If housing weren't so expensive, then labor costs wouldn't be that much greater than elsewhere. You're right, building materials are more expensive because of shipping costs. But if we go back to 1969, before Hawaii's state land use law seriously had an impact, or even 1959, before the law was passed, Hawaii housing prices were about 3 times median family incomes. Today, they're 7 times. The difference is due to the land use law.
How about that? Now, most people here are familiar with the rationale behind our land use policies, which largely has to do with preserving the environment, protecting the aquifer, the source of water in the interior of the island. But you've noted how much development really is taking place. Some people think when they come to Hawaii and they see the island of Oahu and tall buildings, or they see Waikiki, that we've got development all over the place. But you've taken a look at those statistics. How developed are we really?
Well, Oahu is about 30% urbanized.
All right.
And that's by far the most of any of the islands. The average for the state as a whole is 10%. So for Maui, Hawaii, and so on, those islands are probably only about 5% or less urbanized, which means there's a lot of land available. It also is interesting, if you didn't have the state land use law, the difference wouldn't be that great. Instead of being 10% urbanized, it might be 15% urbanized or 20% urbanized statewide. And Oahu might be 40% urbanized instead of 30%. It doesn't take much to relieve that supply constraint that makes housing expensive.
Well, let me recap what you've just said. Basically, that not more than 10% of our islands are urbanized, and that we could urbanize just a little bit more, presumably without impacting the environment, and meet all the housing needs that we have. Is that what you're saying, Randall?
That's what I'm saying. I don't think a government agency could say, okay, we're going to add these acres and let those acres be urbanized. I don't think that would bring down housing prices, because they wouldn't necessarily pick the right acres. I think it would only work as if they simply repealed the law and let people develop wherever they wanted to. And then you would see some more urbanization, but you would still have plenty of open space, still have the mountains, still have the forests, and so forth, that make Hawaii special.
Yes, let me let Joe chime in over here.
Randall, you mentioned Hawaii's land use law. So what did the land use law do in Hawaii?
Well, it divided the state into 3 parts initially, and later they added a 4th. And the 3 parts were urban, agricultural, and conservation. By far, most of the state was put in the agricultural zone. Later, they added a rural zone, I think just because they found some lands that weren't agricultural and they weren't conservation, but still they didn't want anybody to develop them, so they just wanted to put them in a category that couldn't be developed. So the urban zone is basically the urban areas, the cities. And it's really hard to get permits to build outside of the urban areas, which means instead of letting people live the way they want to, and most people everywhere prefer to live in single-family homes, you get high-rises and mid-rise developments and things like that, because that's all people can afford, even though that's not the way people would really like to live.
Now, Randall, you said that the area that has the largest amount of land is that which is zoned for agriculture. But isn't it ironic that we've seen a massive decline over the last several decades in land actually being used in agriculture? So in other words, while this land is not being used particularly for housing and meeting the needs of the population, neither is it being used to grow anything.
You're right. Just between 1982 and 2007, which is the latest data we have, the number of acres used for growing crops declined by almost 60%. And it's ironic, but it's very sadly ironic, because in attempting to preserve agriculture, the state legislature destroyed it. They made housing so expensive, which in turn made labor so expensive, that farmers and canneries could not afford to hire labor and compete against farms growing the same crops, pineapple, sugarcane, or whatever, in places like Costa Rica and Fiji. And so the agriculture industry is not dead, but it's only a shadow of what it used to be. And that's because of the land use law that was designed to protect it.
But Randall, it's counterintuitive to think that doesn't agricultural zoning help agriculture?
Well, agricultural zoning preserves land for agriculture, but if the farmers can't afford to grow crops, then it doesn't preserve agriculture.
Because the workers on the farm don't have a place to live. In other words, it's too expensive for them to find housing. Is that correct?
That's right. You know, if you live in Hawaii, you're not going to be willing to work for $3 an hour because you won't be able to live anywhere. So you'll demand a wage rate that's high enough to support your housing and your other needs. And farmers can't afford to pay that. They can't afford to pay that. Other businesses can, but farmers have to compete directly with pineapple growers and sugarcane growers and other crop growers in Central America and on other Pacific islands that don't have these kinds of land use restrictions.
Randall, it sounds as though there's a little bit of a ruse here that our public officials use, and that is that land use laws which protect agricultural zoning actually are not promoting farming. They actually are harmful to farming. And this is one of these pieces of misinformation that is often floated out there and in policy discussions.
That's right, and it's not just in Hawaii. Everywhere in the country, you have people saying, oh, we have to have these laws to preserve farms, when in fact, nationwide, the United States has more than 1.1 billion acres of farms, and we only grow crops on about 350 million acres. So about a third of the acres are used for growing crops. And the per acre productivities of most of our major crops are growing faster than our population. So the number of acres we need for farms is declining. And yet we see states like Hawaii, Oregon, California, Washington going way out of their way to preserve farms at the expense of making housing a lot more expensive. So they're preserving, they're creating a surplus of things that people don't really need and creating shortages of things that people absolutely need.
Randall, what are some other, you mentioned zoning laws, the land use laws, but what are some other government regulations that have affected our housing market?
Well, here's another sad irony. At least 3 of the counties in Hawaii have passed a law called the Inclusionary zoning law or ordinance that requires that builders sell or rent a particular percentage of the houses they build at below market prices to people who are nominally low income. And that's supposed to relieve the housing shortage, but it actually makes it worse. Because if you're a builder and suddenly your costs go way up because you have to build all these houses and then sell them for less than it costs, first of all, you're not going to build as many houses. And second of all, you're going to charge more for all the houses that you're allowed to sell at market rates.
Yeah. Well, Randall,
if you own an existing home and you see the builders of new homes have raised their prices, you're going to raise the price of your existing home too. So everybody who buys or rents a home is going to see their prices go up, except for the very few lucky people who get to buy an inclusionary zoned house, an affordable house.
We in Hawaii frequently refer to that as affordable housing, which, to use your term earlier, is another sad irony. Randall, we're going to take a short break and come right back and continue this conversation. I'd like to say to our viewers that this is an absolutely fascinating and eye-opening discussion we have with a national expert on land use as well as transportation. And by the way, we'll get to some issues regarding transportation at the end of our program today. Don't go away. I'm Keli Akina with Randal O Toole on Ehana Kako on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network.
Aloha, my name is Justine Espiritu, and I am the co-host of Hawaii Farmers Series. This is my co-host, Matthew Johnson, and we are live with you every Thursday at 4 p.m. at thinktechhawaii.com. And our show focuses on Hawaii's local food community. We feature not only the farmers that are producing our food, but we also feature the supporters and other folks involved in the community that are trying to promote local agriculture.
you doing? It's me, Angus McTech, wishing you to welcome and join us to see us on Hibachi Talk on Think Tech Hawaii. Join my co-hosts, Gordo the Tech Czar and Andrew the Security Guy, every Friday from 1300 to 1345. We look forward to seeing you. We'll talk tech and we'll have some wee bit of fun. And remember, let your wing gang free wherever you be. Aloha!
Welcome back to Ehana Kako, here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Today's conversation is a fascinating one with a national expert in land use policy and transportation, Randal O Toole. And we'll get right back to our conversation with Randal. But first, you've heard the saying, Ehana Kako, which is let's work together. Well, that's what we believe deeply at the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii. Let's work together for a better economy, government, and society, an economy that is prosperous, a government that is transparent and accountable to the people, and a society that is free, in which our constitutional rights are preserved and promoted. Think of the alternative of not working together. If we don't ehana kako, all we'll do is fail to advance into the 21st century and beyond in the way that is really prosperous for people. I want to say thanks to Jay Fidel and all of the wonderful staff and others who put the the Think Tech Hawaii network together, broadcasting about 35 hours of original content every week from downtown Honolulu. You can see that content at thinktechhawaii.com. And now back to our conversation with Randal. Randal, you said some fascinating things in the first segment, and it is a sad irony that the land use law, which on the surface may promote good things like agriculture, actually in the end makes life harder on farmers. Would you say that one of the ways in which the costs to farmers actually hurts them is that it makes them have little alternative but to let their land be used by those who can afford such costs, such as high-end real estate developers?
Yes, although it's hard for those high-end real estate developers to develop that land. But, you know, the economy in Hawaii has changed dramatically since 1961. In 1961, Hawaii had only recently been connected to the mainland with jet air service. A few years before, almost everybody who visited Hawaii did so by ship. So today, Hawaii's economy is really based on tourism much more than it was in 1961. Agriculture is much less important, especially since there are so many other places where those same crops can be grown. So on a scale of what you would do, where you would put your priorities, agriculture is not the high priority. The high priority is providing an attractive place for people to live and people to visit.
Well, I'm glad you talk about priorities because very often the efforts that are being made to help the agriculture industry are small efforts from the bottom up that may help small farmers to get up and running, but we don't have real policy change. And I would say the same is true with regard to our housing situation, that our government puts out small efforts such as feeding, clothing, or relocating the poor, but doesn't really have any policy efforts involved in this. So I want to go to the research that you've recently published with us, and that is the idea that the land use policy has a disparate impact upon minorities. Can you explain that concept of disparate impact?
Yes, in 1968, Lyndon Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. And what that law said is that you could not treat people differently if you were selling or renting homes based on race, ethnic group, religion, or things like that. And that's called disparate treatment. If I said, you can't rent my house because you're black or because you're Native Hawaiian or because you're whatever, that's disparate treatment. Well, after the law was passed, somebody said, well, what happens if you adopt a policy that is more likely to affect minorities than it will affect the majority population? Even though you aren't necessarily saying you're discriminating against blacks or Native Hawaiians or other minorities, you effectively are. That's called disparate impact. And that was a controversial issue, but it went to the Supreme Court last June, and the Supreme Court said, yes, if you pass a policy that differentially treats low-income minorities or other minorities, that policy violates the Fair Housing Act. And so when Hawaii makes housing more expensive, that's potentially a violation of the Fair Housing Act too.
That's a fascinating way to look at it, so that this discrimination that results in disparate impact is not something merely overt, but rather takes place rather subtly through policies that are implemented. And you're saying that our land use policy has disparate impact upon ethnic minorities. Now, can you give us a couple of examples of ethnic minorities that are impacted by our land use policy?
Well, unfortunately, African Americans are kind of a bellwether in this. Their incomes have been persistently about 60% of white incomes. And when housing prices go up, they tend to leave. And this has been true all over the country. San Francisco, for example, saw a 10% increase in its population, but a 10% decline in its black population. And you go city by city, and it turns out Honolulu is one of the cities that this has happened to. Honolulu saw a 12% increase in its population between 2000 and 2010, but a 4% decline in its black population. And so that's clearly a disparate impact resulting from the high housing prices. Well, now other minorities might not be declining in number, but the quality of their housing might be changing. We can track this. We can see what percentage of Native Hawaiians, what percentage of Latinos, what percentage of Asians and other groups are moving from single-family homes to multifamily homes, or having to live in rental properties where before they lived in properties they owned themselves. And what we find is that when you have high housing prices, you have a much bigger effect on minorities, on low-income minorities, than you do on whites and other high-income.
But Randall, what about folks who say, sure, a lot of these land use policies may have affected minorities, but the intent was to help them. I mean, in other words, we didn't, the policies weren't intended to hurt these minorities, and so would that hold up in a court of law?
The Supreme Court said that intent doesn't matter. Now, it was a 5-4 decision, and the 4 who dissented said that intent does matter. But the majority said that intent doesn't matter. What does matter, though, is if the state that has the land use law has a legitimate justification for that law, like they want to preserve farmland, and if there's no other way of accomplishing that goal that doesn't harm, doesn't have disparate impacts on low-income people. So the first question is it saving farmland? Well, it's not saving farmland, so that doesn't qualify as a legitimate justification. Another justification they often use is it saves energy. But is it saving energy? Well, it's not saving much if it saves any at all. And there's a lot better ways of saving energy that don't make housing less affordable. So the Supreme Court, the majority of the Supreme Court doesn't think intent is an issue. However, there's a man named Richard Florida who says cities should try to attract what he calls the creative class of people. By creative class, he means people with college educations who earn a lot of money. And by saying what we should do is attract people who have college educations, he's implying we should push away people who don't have college educations, who tend to have lower incomes. And a lot of cities have said, hey, this Richard Florida has got a great idea. We should pass these kinds of policies to get richer people to move to our city. Well, then there's definitely intent involved. And even if you agree with the minority of the Supreme Court that intent is an issue, intent is clearly involved here when they're saying we want to only attract the rich people and not the poor.
Well, Randall, we clearly have a case here where there are good intentions, but there are bad outcomes. And what you're looking at are the outcomes. I know you mentioned earlier that it wouldn't be a practical solution to have the government simply increase the amount of land that is developed upon, because the government would not necessarily select the right land to develop for housing and land to keep for agriculture and so forth. Here, you're talking about the fact that the government is involved in many cities in designing what population should come to the city, that a creative population, so to speak, a college-educated population, should be attracted by government. And so underscoring both of these examples is the role of government. So I'm wondering if we could just segue here for a few moments to chat a little bit about why government trying to create solutions, even these seemingly well-intentioned solutions, is a problem because it's government.
Well, the real problem is that government doesn't take into account price. Prices are signals. They're signals to you as a consumer of what different things are worth. They're signals to producers of what they can get if they produce various things. And if you have a free marketplace, or even a moderately free marketplace with a little bit, but not a lot of government regulation, then prices can work themselves out and you can get a balance, for example, of agriculture versus housing, or industry versus commercial areas. But if government steps in, it's going to make its decisions based on criteria other than price, because once it starts regulating heavily, the prices that result aren't anything like what a true market price would be. And so it can't rely on those prices. If the government of Hawaii did rely on prices, it would have done something about this a long time ago, long before housing prices reached seven times median family incomes.
Well, you know, what I appreciate, go ahead.
But it doesn't. And so it passes rules, it limits the amount of land available, and then it restricts how the land can be used, even the land that can be developed. It puts lots of restrictions on, and that makes housing more expensive too.
What I appreciate about your analysis of price is that government solutions that interfere with the natural workings of the marketplace simply create bad outcomes. And we've used the term free market here, and many people don't realize that free market has a great deal to do with simply being in a mode of common sense with regard to the market. Now Joe has a question.
So Randall, I just wanted to summarize, and tell me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that the courts have ruled that if these land use policies disparatively impact minorities, then there's a case to be had bringing these to court. And but how would one bring someone to court like this? I mean, would we have to find a minority who's been impacted by Hawaii's land use regulation and then try to find our way to the court, or how would that work?
You'd have to find an aggrieved party who's been harmed by it. But interestingly, the court has said if a white person, for example, would argue that because of these policies, my community has become less diverse. You know, we're just white people here, or whites and Asians. Asians tend to be have higher incomes than other minorities, but we don't have as many blacks, we don't have as many natives, we don't have as many Latinos. And that lack of diversity has hurt our community. Well, the Supreme Court has said, well, that gives somebody standing to challenge these rules as well. But it would certainly be helpful to find a native Hawaiian or a black African American or other minorities that have low incomes and make them a party to the case. And then you'd go to court, and the three questions the court would have is, can you show that these policies make housing expensive? And then they'd ask the government, well, do you have a justification for these policies? And then they'd ask you, is there a better way of accomplishing the goal that the government's trying to accomplish here other than these policies?
I see. And then a success in the courts would look like what? And then how would that affect the folks living in Hawaii?
I think that a success in the courts would just effectively repeal the state land use law. And anybody who owned land outside of an urban area who wanted to put a housing development on it, or a single house, or a grocery store, or whatever, the state would not be able to stop them from doing so unless it had a legitimate reason, like they could show it was definitely impacting everybody else's groundwater or something like that. But not for illegitimate reasons, like we're going to destroy the agricultural industry to save it.
Well, Randall, I want to punctuate the point you've just made. You've highlighted a potential solution to the housing crisis here in the state of Hawaii. one which may not intuitively come to mind because most of the solutions deal with the ground level of feeding or clothing or moving the homeless around. But you have highlighted a potential policy solution that could have sweeping impact on the state of Hawaii. When we come back, I'm going to ask you where this is being pursued, or the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court is being pursued elsewhere throughout the country. But until then, let's take a short break, and we'll be right back in a moment with my guest, Randal O Toole, as we talk about an unusual but very powerful potential solution to the housing crisis in Hawaii.
Aloha, my name is Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I'm the host of Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com. We air live on the internet and also on Oceanic Channel 16. I'd invite you to come for a fresh new show every Tuesday from 12 to 1 o'clock. I try to bring on guests that give us a different viewpoint on aspects of sustainability in Hawaii, as well as trying to unpack some of the difficult concepts of measuring and achieving sustainability, particularly with regard to sustainable economic growth and prosperity in Hawaii. Please join us every Tuesday from 12 to 1 p.m. Mahalo, aloha.
Aloha! Hello, my name is Patrick Bratton. I'm host of Global Connections here at ThinkTech Hawaii. We broadcast live every Thursday at 1 p.m. We bring Hawaii to the world and the world to Hawaii, talking about international events and various things of interest to the audience. Please join me. I look forward to talking with you and having you get to meet some of my guests. Aloha.
Welcome back to the final episode today of Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. One of the things that we do notice more and more is the rise in homelessness and the increasing housing crisis. Every one of us here in Hawaii knows of people who've moved away to the mainland. My own parents, both Native Hawaiians, moved away. They were lifelong residents, so had been their parents and their parents' parents and so forth. It's such an unusual thing in their later life to move away simply because they couldn't afford housing here. And so we're very familiar with this. And yet our state continues to make policies that exacerbate the situation. Randal O Toole has a solution, and switching back to Randal now. Randal, are there any people in our country who are responding to the United States Supreme Court decision regarding disparate impact and trying to do something about changing policies across the nation?
Not so far as I know. I'm in touch with the free market community, groups like Cato, Reason, Competitive Enterprise Institute, and so far they aren't doing anything on this. I'm not so much in touch with groups that are interested in housing affordability and the impact on minorities, like the NAACP. And so some of those groups might be thinking about doing something on this, and I'm certainly going to support them if they do. My goal is to persuade the courts and find somebody who will challenge these laws in California, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii, which have the strictest laws in the nation, and then go into New England, which also has some strict laws.
Well, Randal, I appreciate your interest in this. We also would like to ask you a few questions regarding another area of your expertise, and that is with regard to transportation.
Yeah, Randal, I know you've been to Hawaii before, and if you sat in traffic before, just to let you know, I think the traffic has gotten even worse since then.
In fact, Randal and I have sat in traffic together.
Okay.
As I've served as your chauffeur, but we can't wait to have you back. But what are your thoughts about this traffic situation in Hawaii, Randal?
Well, there's a lot of urban planners who believe that you can't build your way out of congestion. And so instead of trying to solve the congestion problem, some of them actually try to make it worse in the hope that they can get people out of their cars and onto transit. And Honolulu actually has some of the highest transit ridership in the country per capita. I think New York is first and Honolulu is second or third in terms of per capita transit ridership per year. And it has one of the highest rates of transit commuting, but that's not good enough. They want to spend a lot more money on transit, particularly the rail line, and I think that's actually going to hurt transit in the long run, but it's certainly not going to relieve any traffic.
Yeah, but Randal, doesn't a rail line intuitively, wouldn't that help the traffic situation? I mean, after all, traffic just seems to be getting worse and worse. We don't see any solutions on the horizon. So isn't the only solution to build rail?
The problem with rail is that it only works when you're taking a lot of people from point A to point B. And people don't live in point A and they don't work in point B. They live in points A, B, C, D, E, F, G on through Z, and they work in points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and on through 100. And so, you know, they have hundreds of thousands of different origins and thousands of different destinations, and trains don't work very well for something like that. Freight trains, for example, are most profitable when they're bringing coal from a mine to a power plant, or they're bringing grain from an elevator to a port, or they're bringing containers from a port to an interior distribution spot, A to B. And buses work a little better than going from A to B, but trains are especially bad at it. They're an obsolete form of travel for passengers.
So what you're saying is that there would have been a little more logic to the rail system if we had targeted a densely populated urban corridor, such as between Waikiki and the airport, but instead we're basically targeting neither destinations nor origins of most people, and building most of the rail over open space heading out to the west of the main island.
I'm skeptical that rail would make any sense going from Waikiki to the airport. Even in Waikiki is a pretty big place. It would have to have a lot of different stops to serve all the different hotels there. And so you would end up, unless you had all of those different stops, you'd end up losing a lot of customers. And if you did have all those different stops, then anybody at the hotels furthest from the airport would find it would take a long time to get to the airport because the train would stop so often getting there. Trains are just not very good at that kind of movement, and buses work better because you can have individual buses going from each hotel straight to the airport without stopping in between.
But Randall, so is the solution then just to sit in more traffic as we wait either for the rail to continue to be built or maybe in your view to be stopped? Is traffic in Hawaii just going to get worse?
There's a lot of solutions to traffic. One is traffic signal coordination. Very few cities have coordinated all their traffic signals to minimize delay. And that's very cheap for less than a half a mile of the cost of the rail line. They could coordinate all the traffic signals in Honolulu, but they're not doing it. Another cheap solution is congestion pricing. A lot of people don't like the idea of paying tolls, but highways are a unique resource in that when demand increases, supply decreases. What I mean by that is when you have free-flowing traffic, a freeway can move 2,000 vehicles an hour or more. When the traffic gets congested, it can only move about 1,000 vehicles an hour. So at the time when people need it most, it becomes the least productive. With a small toll, we can encourage people to change the time of their travel a little bit, some people, and that way we can keep the highways productive at 2,000 vehicles per lane per hour all day long, rather than just 1,000 vehicles during rush hour.
But Randall, now you mentioned toll, and now I'm thinking about dealing with coins and change as I, drive past. And I mean, wouldn't that add more traffic to the mix?
Well, if you had toll booths, yes, but we don't have to do it that way anymore. We have electronic tolling, and my home state of Oregon is talking about replacing the gas tax with a per mile user fee. And in fact, I'm one of the volunteers who is experimenting with this. They asked for volunteers, so I don't pay gas taxes anymore. Instead, I pay a per mile fee, and eventually it'll be set up so that the fees I pay will go to the roads I drive on. So I'm not subsidizing anybody else, and nobody's subsidizing me.
Randall, you mentioned some technology solutions. What other technologies in the future might have a big impact on our traffic situation?
Well, self-driving cars are going to revolutionize everything. They're going to make that train become two streaks of rust, because nobody's going to ride it, because the self-driving cars are going to be able to move a lot more people down a highway. Most of the reason why we have traffic congestion is slow human reflexes. And computers have much faster reflexes, so a lane that can move 2,000 human-driven cars per hour will probably be able to move 5,000 or 6,000 or more computer-driven cars per mile.
Okay,
per
wait,
hour.
so you're saying that, like, today I was looking at traffic and I saw the car in front, they were all stopped and the car in front pulled forward, and then, seconds later the next car pulls forward, and then there's sort of this accordion effect in the traffic flow. You're saying that with automated cars or self-driving cars, they would all sort of move quicker.
Yes, and that accordion effect would disappear. In fact, many new cars today are being made with what's called adaptive cruise control, which means your car senses the car in front of you and keeps a fixed distance or a fixed number of seconds behind that car. And when 20 or 25% of cars on the road are using adaptive cruise control, that's going to increase the road capacities by probably 25%. So instead of 2,000 vehicles per hour, it'll be 2,500 or more vehicles per hour down the lane. So as we automate driving more and more, we'll have a lot less congestion. And 15 years from now, I think congestion will be something that people remember vaguely, but won't be around anymore.
But would we need the entire population to suddenly adopt self-driving cars, or would even a few self-driving cars in our traffic flow have an impact?
Well, you mentioned the accordion effect, when one car accelerates and another car pauses and accelerates and so on. When 25% or more of the cars on the road are self-driving, a lot of that accordion effect will go away. And so it doesn't have to be every car on the road, although in the long run it will be. But it only has to be 25 or 50%. And I estimate by 2030, close to a majority of cars on the road will be self-driven cars.
We've got a few seconds left, Randall. How feasible is a Hawaii future with autonomous self-driving vehicles? What's the technology? How soon do you think it'd be possible?
It's the only feasible transportation future. The technology has already been developed, and it's all based on mapping. It's based on very precise maps, and then it's based on sensors on your car. You'll be able to, if you buy a car today, you'll probably be able to upgrade it to a self-driving car 5 years from now for about $1,000.
Well,
so
that's fascinating.
It'll be rapidly adopted, and by 2025, a large percentage of cars on the road will be self-driven.
Randall, I want to thank you so very much for sharing your expertise today, and also as a Grassroot Institute scholar. Great talking with you, and looking forward to a future where perhaps everyone can have a house and everyone can have an autonomous vehicle. Thanks for being with us, Randall.
Thank you.
Joe, in just about 15 seconds, what'd you think about Randall's presentation today?
Well, I would love to have a self-driving car and actually just to have it drive me somewhere and then just go park yourself.
There you
That would be
go.
great.
Well, what a future we can look forward to. And that's what we enjoy doing at the Grassroot Institute, of envisioning a better future for all as we work together. Until next time, e hana kākou. Let's work together. Keli Akina broadcasting to you from the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Aloha.